Welcome to the Think Christian podcast, where we talk about faith and pop culture, because there's no such thing as secular. I'm Josh Larson, and before we dive into all things Stevie Wonder, would you believe that we're already planning our best of 2024 episodes of the Think Christian podcast? That means we need to hear from you, the listener, so we can share some of your picks on the show. Let us know on social media or email us. Tell us your favorite movies, music, and television from this year. So again, social is a good place to do that. Even better, tcpodcast at thinkchristian.net. That's our email address. You can leave us a note or even a voice recording, and then we can play that on the show. Be sure to tell us why your pick is your favorite, especially in light of what we do here at Think Christian. Again, that's tcpodcast at thinkchristian.net, tcpodcast at thinkchristian.net. Now, on to Stevie Wonder. Earlier this fall, I stumbled upon a limited podcast series called The Wonder of Stevie, hosted by New York Times critic Wesley Morris. The 7 episodes cover a 5-year span beginning in 1972, during which Wonder released 5 monumental albums. Here they are: Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness's First Finale, and Songs in the Key of Life. Since I had a sadly limited knowledge of Stevie Wonder and a ton of respect for Morris as a critic, I thought I'd give the podcast a listen. I was hooked right away. I learned a ton. I got to hear a bunch of great music, and I found much to consider from a Think Christian perspective. So I gathered 2 folks who are more familiar with Stevie Wonder than I am, Aarik Danielson and Kathryn Freeman, to have a conversation about his work. Let's get to it. Welcome to Aarik Danielson and Kathryn Freeman. So you two, Stevie Wonder. I think maybe we should start at the top here by sharing a little bit about our relationship to Stevie Wonder's music before we listened to some of this podcast. That's the reason we're doing this, The Wonder of Stevie podcast. I personally have a confession to make on that front, but I'm going to let the 2 of you go first. So Aarik, maybe we'll start with you. What was your understanding, your relationship with Stevie Wonder as a music artist in previous years?
Yeah, so I clearly did not bring the attachments from the Black community in, but otherwise my story is very similar to Wesley Morris's that he shares on the podcast. I'm positive that I first encountered Stevie Wonder on an early episode of The Cosby Show. I think he may have also done some of the PBS kids shows around that time. And so I kind of encountered him as this fully formed cultural force. It was clear to me even as a kid, the way people were talking about him or to him, that he this was not just a brand new guy. He clearly was coming in with some sort of history. So I kind of encountered him that way first. And then I would say in high school or maybe early college, I had a really big Motown phase that I would say probably hasn't actually ended. And so I bought his greatest hits CD and was really just okay, this is some of the coolest stuff I've ever heard, but still kind of was living in the realm of all of his singles, kind of the songs that everybody knows if they know any of them. And so I really don't think it was till maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I was okay, I need to go back through and listen to the records. And that was when I discovered this run of 70s records that they cover on the podcast and realized, the deep cuts are just as good as the singles. All the songs that everybody knows and plays and are, is out in pop culture. Those songs are amazing and are renowned for a reason. But I think it was then that I realized everything else is just that good too. And so, yeah, it was just kind of a progressive, it was almost going backwards, going from some big pop culture icon or symbol to actually getting to the artists themselves.
Living in the realm of his singles. That sounds very familiar to me. But how about you, Kathryn? What's your experience been?
So I grew up in a Motown household. My parents were much more my dad was a huge Temptations fan, I feel and then my mom was a huge Diana Ross person. And so I feel those are the soundtracks of our childhood. I will say in our household, we love Stevie, but in terms of the album we heard the most in our household growing up was Songs in the Key of Life. I think it wasn't until adulthood that I realized the sort of what the podcast refers to as a classic period. And like, I knew all the singles, but in terms of like an album of like just being familiar with, it was probably for me in our household, like Songs in the Key of Life went like triple platinum in the Freeman household. And then, yeah, like I think as an adult, like still like the singles everyone knows. I think also too, when I think about my dad, like, Isn't She Lovely? Like he kind of was like obsessed with that song and would play it for us, me and like my sister all the time. And I don't think I realized until like I was older that Stevie Wonder had written it for his daughter. I think also too, since my dad has passed, like I always feel like a special connection to that song. But I think also too, the big part of like Stevie Wonder that exists for me in the imagination is just kind of beyond his musical genius of like sort of the integral role he played in getting Martin Luther King Jr. for that to be like a federal holiday. The African American version of like Happy Birthday was like a Stevie Wonder thing. And then I feel like as an adult, I saw him in concert. He came to ACL. It's probably been about 10 years now. And to this day, as someone who is like a Beyonce connoisseur, I thought it was very funny. This is an aside. And of course, I'm going to figure out a way to bring this around to Beyonce, but I did think it was interesting that he began the podcast making that comparison. But as someone who has seen Beyonce in concert many, many times, Stevie Wonder is probably the only other performer I've seen in my life that I was like, oh my gosh. I think I went into it thinking, okay, he's blind. Like, how much could he really do? But like, it was, yeah, there's just that will always be like seared in my mind. And so I think I also just have like a relationship to him as like the sort of like live performance of just like the genius of who he is and like the way in which that fully comes across in a live version in a way that even as genius as the albums are, it was just like another level.
Yeah, it's that stage presence that was the revelation for me, Kathryn. And it's not because I got the chance to see him live. As a matter of fact, I'm kicking myself because he was just here in Chicago, I think a couple of weeks ago, and didn't get to see him. But the live presence I sensed in the 2021 documentary Summer of Soul, directed by Questlove, who, by the way, appears in the Wonder of Stevie podcast many times. I was stunned by footage of Wonder here. And this is the Harlem Cultural Festival of 1969. So just before this period of albums that the podcast covers, I think my perception was similar to yours, Kathryn, is like, I knew of him sitting at keyboards and, you know, that image on stage. And he was also playing the drums. There's footage of him playing the drums, but it was like this out of body experience he was having there in Summer of Soul in the documentary. And I just thought, okay, I've got to do some work here because this is not the Stevie Wonder in my mind. I think for me, the confession is that I completely took him for granted up until that point. And I think his ubiquity was part of that for me. The singles, again, it was more about where I would hear these songs. So I'm thinking about like, Isn't She Lovely or My Cherie Amour. I would hear these in the grocery store. I'd hear them in the mall. I heard them in the dentist office. And then because I failed to like explore further, I wrote him off as sort of this pleasant, maybe a bit triacly, kind of benign, honestly. And one of the things I've learned from listening to the Wonder of Stevie podcast is that he was so much more than that. Not just that physical presence on stage where it's like, okay, this is not the Stevie of the dentist's office, what I'm looking at here. But also we learned that he's a live wire intellectually and musically. He's voracious in those sense. The political, you touched on this, Kathryn, already, but the political dimension to him as a cultural figure. And then, of course, the spiritual elements, which we'll probably dive into. So all of a sudden, I'm thinking, I had this all wrong. This guy's almost maybe a little dangerous in some ways, which is the opposite of what my perception was.
And I think also too, like, I love what the podcast did in terms of even the songs that are like ubiquitous, like My Cherie Amour or like Isn't She Lovely, like the history of those songs. And then you think about it, like at the time in which those things are written, it was pretty radical. You know, his partnership with his first wife, Sarita. You think about like kind of culturally where we were when those songs were written about like the women's rights movement. I think maybe it was former President Obama and maybe like the second or third episode where he talks about there are many ways to do political, but like one of the ways Stevie's brilliance is just like the everyday, like how you treat people and like the radicalness or like the beauty just found in Black people's everyday existence. You know, there is overtly political in this sort of classic album run. But like, I think for me, like listening to the podcast, what came to me, he was like, yeah, very radical. Even those songs that we hear in like the elevator or in the doctor's office or in the grocery store. And like now we associate with like kind of like a sappiness, the context in which they were written, they are extremely political to like in the 70s write an ode to your daughter in the midst of like beauty ideals that were very kind of harsh towards Black women to like write this love story of like, you're lovely. That is very political in a way that I think sometimes now, 50 years later, feel very like sappy.
Yeah, I think time has diffused it. Again, for me, it's the context has diffused it. And so I was really grateful for this podcast to bring that context back to the forefront for me, or at least educate me in the first place. So I guess that's what I'd like to hear from the two of you also, is because this was, as I said, mostly all new to me. I'm wondering if there was anything new that either of you learned while listening to some of these episodes, or maybe if it wasn't brand new, was there something fresh? It kind of refreshed what you kind of knew in the background. But you're like, oh yeah, that's right about Stevie Wonder's music. Anything like that pop to mind while you were listening to some of these episodes, Aarik?
I think the main thing, and I do really appreciate this about the podcast, was just the interchange of relationships between people in kind of the Motown world, just learning a lot about the various like personal and artistic things that he was navigating, especially as he stepped in. They talk about in that first episode how he stepped in from kind of being this almost novelty act to them going, oh, like if you let him write his own songs, this stuff is like unreal. So I don't think I realized how long a period that was, or kind of how much he had to navigate before really being able to step into his own artistically. This isn't new, but I just like to talk about times that I feel like that I'm right about something. I really did appreciate I love Wesley Morris's work, so it felt good to be on the same page as him. He talked about the idea of Fulfilling This' first finale being his favorite album in the classic run, and that's my favorite too. And so that episode was cool just to hear kind of the different perceptions of that record. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we get into spiritual themes, but like what Stevie was working out kind of in that record, just to go deeper with that, like to kind of let that kind of take what I had heard before and kind of just make it so much richer and so much deeper was really a welcome thing too.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get back to Fulfilling This' first finale. But yeah, what were you going to add, Kathryn?
Yeah, I was going to say that was the album in the classic run that I was least familiar with. So I liked that episode as well because I feel like I just learned a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know. But I also really loved, I think it's again in the second or third episode where they talk about when he opened for the Rolling Stones. I didn't know any of that history.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating.
And then I think also too to like juxtapose it with how they received Prince in 1981 was also just really fascinating to me because again, I didn't know any of that history. And it's like one of those things where like I know because Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney are very vocal about how they were influenced by like the Motown sound and like African American blues. So like I wasn't shocked that they would ask Stevie Wonder to open for them, but I think the sort of like how that was received by the audience, just in the ways in which, yeah, that they were like to their audience, like, you need to hear this. I was really struck over and over again about how mesmerizing he is in the way in which he could capture and hold people's attention and give music sonic depth. I think about the sort of Cowboy Carter genres are a funny little thing of like when they played that little snippet of him going from his song to Satisfaction and like the smoothness of bringing kind of maybe what is hidden to some to like forefront of like how these things are connected and that there's not these kind of clear cut lines. I don't know. I didn't know any of that. And I was really struck by that. And I thought it was really beautiful in the ways in which Mick Jagger like championed him. And also too, in a way that like we think of Prince now as this like unfathomable that people would boo Prince.
Sure.
But to think about like, yeah, what makes Stevie special. And I'm sure maybe like 40 years later, people who booed Prince would be like, oh, that was probably not my finest moment. I didn't appreciate it. I didn't appreciate it for what it was at the time. I think it speaks a lot to like the specialness and uniqueness of Stevie Wonder's genius and that the ways in which his sort of live performances are just mesmerizing. So I thought that was, I think, really something that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the expansiveness of his music and his persona, that it could encapsulate all of these different sounds. There's a breadth there. I think one of the many things that I realized is the layers and levels of instrumentation well beyond the keyboards and the harmonica that I was familiar with, you know, and I was fascinated to learn about Tonto, this massive synthesizer that he embraced during the early part of this time period and came to love like so many of the songs that used that. So there is this breadth and this expansiveness to the musicality that you can sense coming out in his live performances as well, his relationships with other artists, even in different musical genres. And I think that also echoes the spirituality you see at play in these albums. There's an expansiveness there too. So maybe we can turn there now. And I should probably give a TC disclaimer that's come up here and there when we talk about some of these things. We're not really interested here in vetting an artist's faith, or like giving a stamp of approval if they do or do not claim to be a Christian. We're not really looking to do that. I'm more curious, I should say, to hear what the spirituality that's on these 5 albums prompted in the two of you. What resonated with you? What maybe perplexed you? What challenged you as a person of faith? And I do want to get back to Fulfillingness's first finale, which episode 4 focuses on. This album came out in 1974. Wesley Morris describes it in the podcast as his most spiritual album. And the context here, one of you referred to, is this came out in the wake of a car accident that Wonder barely survived. It left him in a coma for 4 days. And then sometime after that is when this music was produced and then released. So one of the guests on this episode is gospel singer-songwriter Yolanda Adams. And boy, her breakdown with Morris, not only of the musicality, but the spirituality of the songs on this album was absolutely the highlight for me. The stuff they were digging into. And I feel like they were coming from somewhat different vantage points, and hearing them meet where the music is really represented, I think, the expansiveness of Stevie Wonder's music, especially in terms of spirituality. So that was a highlight for me. I'm not going to repeat any of their breakdown, but I do want to quote Adams talking about the song, "Heaven is 10 zillion light years away." So here's what she said. "Of course, I know the whole album, but when I heard as a kid, 'Heaven is 10 zillion light years away,' I was like, whoa, this is the way that we should give the love of God to everybody." So that was Yolanda Adams. And I think that speaks to the generosity in Wonder's music that I did come to appreciate from the podcast. The literal generosity and the sheer volume of music he created in this time period, these 5 albums. As I said earlier, the musical generosity, going back to the sonic layers and the instruments and the voices, so many voices in a lot of these songs. But then I think there's a spiritual generosity too, this insistence on spreading love. In the case of "Heaven is 10 zillion light years away," the persistent, generous love of God, quite literally here. So Aarik, I think in email exchanges planning this show, you said this song, "Heaven is 10 zillion light years away," is maybe your favorite Stevie Wonder song?
It is. And I feel like that episode and that breakdown that you talked about was so good. And so I feel like it's like my experience of that song is changing minute by minute. But one of the things that I really have always appreciated about that song is I think for myself, I mean, it's just how I'm wired. It comes out in my writing. Like I'm always kind of wrestling with this dichotomy of like, what does it mean for God to be present and absent at the same time? I mean, he's literally writing a psalm in that song. I mean, he's talking about where is your God, and where is he and how far away is he and how far away are we? But as you said, in the middle of that, there is still, like you said, a persistent generosity, a relentlessness to his view that like we all should still be at some point drawn up into the love of God. We all should still be drawn up into the life of God, even if there are these things that are keeping us apart now. I don't know. That just feels like such a beautiful, I don't want to say blueprint because I don't think anyone can copy it, but such like a beautiful guide to kind of navigating those presences and those absences and maintaining some sort of trust and insistence and faith that like everything that's supposed to draw near will eventually draw near, but we're just not there yet. I continue to wrestle with that song. I'm thinking about it more and more. And those themes I think flow throughout the record for sure, as he's thinking about like how and when and who will go to heaven and like, what is that going to look like? But just in that song, I feel like it's such an encapsulation of his wrestling, but also his faith. Like there are doubts there, but there are certainties there too. And they kind of feed one another. And it's pretty amazing to bear witness to.
Yeah, I love that you said the psalm, because this morning when I was getting dressed and preparing, that's the thing that kept ringing over and over in my head of even across albums, these are psalms in a way of the ways in which he's able to write these deep longing questions in response to whatever is going on socially, whatever is going on personally, and the ways in which he's able to universalize them and bring that out of us. When you were talking about the sort of wrestling with the he's present but feeling like he's far. I think for any Christian, I don't want to generalize, but I feel like that's something that at some point in your walk of faith that you wrestle with of God, I know intellectually you're present in my circumstances, but I don't feel that, and then trying to navigate that distance. And I think why the Psalms resonate with us today, I was oh my God, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was getting ready. And what I wanted to say is I see so much of that again, not the same as being a Christian or like any kind of definitive, but I see so much of that in the work of Stevie Wonder and the full range of human emotions. Like it's not just one thing. I think with that album in particular, like coming out of a car accident, like this huge traumatic event and being in a coma and the ways in which that like provides clarity and refocuses. And, you know, they talk about that kind of being like a shift even amongst the like classic period and it being quieter than some of the other albums of that period. Then that sort of solitude and like questioning and the sort of clarity that can come from these big life events that maybe we see at the time and are tragic and unfortunate, but in the ways in which they send us on different trajectories. Again, I said that's the album I was least familiar with, and I was like, okay, I have to go back and like just like sit with this album because it's like so profound.
Well, and I want to say too, I just want to go back to something that Kathryn said that I thought was so important earlier, like the ways in which the political is woven into these songs. Like this song, I mean, he's not shying away from talking about racism, talking about the way that he's been treated as a Black man. And in that way, treating this question of like, who does God love and how does God love us and how close are we to his love as a political question, but not in a way that usually reads as political, right? And I really love that. I love how he doesn't stop talking about the things that are happening to him. This idea that we're going to somehow separate this like great question of who God is and who we are. He's not going to take that out of the context of his real life, right? Like that has to have a bearing on his real life. It has to matter to his real life and to the lives of the people around him. And so I just love that that's another song that I feel like does what Kathryn talked about earlier. It does it so well. It's all in there. You can't begin to subdivide those things. They all have to be present in the same set of lyrics in the same song. I just keep thinking of the word rich. Like there's so much richness to the text. There's so much richness to the music. And that song definitely embodies that.
Yeah, richness is a good word for so much of this music. And that universality, that universal quality, I think he achieves that by being personal in the way you were talking about, Aarik. And it brings to mind another quote I jotted down from Yolanda Adams on this episode that I wanted to share. It's just really interesting as we're thinking about these songs as psalms and how might they function that way for various audiences. She says at one point, "We knew this guy was not just a guy trying to just make money from his art and his talent. He really was speaking from his heart and his soul to give messages of love to people who may not ever step foot in a church, but would be able to receive it from him." And I think it's that last part that is, we're kind of circling around here, is that quality in his music. That was just so incredible. So we could probably go on and on. Was there anything else either of you received as listeners from Wonder's music while revisiting it through the podcast, or have we covered it? Wanted to give you one more chance before we sign off here.
I just wanted to bring up, I think it was in like the first episode where they talked about like blindness and the spirituality of like blindness and how people think of like blind people as having like some special kind of oracle or like it's like a common trope. And I think that's like interesting. I always was struck by intervisions because I don't know, something about having vision and it being intervision because he is visually impaired or blind. Over the course of our conversation, right? The ways in which he makes the personal, political, and universal, that maybe in the case of Stevie Wonder, in some ways that might actually be true. Because even that episode where she was talking about the ability for people outside the church to receive love, and just thinking about the role of spiritual or like ministry kinds of leaders, and like that maybe is what God is calling us to do as disciples. Like there will be people we encounter in life that would never step foot inside of a church kind of thing, but like the ability to like make the love of God both personal and political for them. In some ways, I thought I was really struck with that sort of like framing at the beginning of being like, you know, people always think this about blind people, and I don't know where, you know, Morris kind of landed on that kind of thing, but then it's just like thinking about like the genius. He's so gifted, and I just
Well, it's insight, right? You're talking about insight.
Insight.
So it is,
that's the word I'm looking for.
It is interesting in this context with his personal physical situation. It was interesting how they handled that. I don't think they even referenced the fact that he is visually impaired until a little while in, which again, going back to the grocery store perception of Stevie Wonder, it's people like me. It's one of the first things we think about, right? And so I think maybe it was strategic of the podcast is to bring it in, but maybe a little later. And then, you know, touch on it here and there, but not really pursue it, except acknowledge that, that is kind of this trope that's out there when you think of fictional characters and the ways it may and may not be true in the case of Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, that was really good. Insight was the word I was looking for. So thank you.
You got it. Aarik, anything else before we go?
Yeah, I mean, nothing like, you know, life altering, but I think I was just reminded going back to some of these records and like how the deep cuts are as good as the singles, like side 2 is as good as side 1. And we've talked a bit about kind of the generosity that Stevie Wonder offers his listeners. And I think it just kind of reminded me that like as listeners, we can offer that same generosity back to an artist. Like I can't change anything at this point. Like we're not an album oriented society at this point. We're a singles oriented society, and that's fine. That has its strengths and its weaknesses. But I think like so often we're trying to understand, well, what did this artist mean in this one song? And it's like, well, the one song should stand on its own, but also like, have you listened to it in context of what else they're saying? Like, Stevie Wonder can't say everything he thinks about God in one song. Like we can't say everything we think about Stevie Wonder on this podcast, right? Like, and I think I was just reminded to really like, I was just luxuriating in those records and thinking like this whole thing matters. Like from the first note to the last note, it's all trying to pull together. And so I think I was just reminded like artists who are giving me something, who are being generous to me as a listener, I want to remember to afford them that same generosity and feel like that there can be a relational aspect to listening that I think it's always there. It's always inherent, but we don't think about it probably as much as we should.
Yeah, and I think it is something that's getting a little bit lost in the changes that have come to the ways we listen to music nowadays, for sure. Well, thank you both very much. Unfortunately, none of these Stevie Wonder albums are going to be eligible for our best music of 2024 episode that's going to be coming up. I don't know if the two of you are going to be on that one yet. I have to gather
we'll
everyone's
see.
picks, so we'll see for their favorites of the year, but both of you will be on one of those shows, either talking TV, movies, or maybe music again. So thank you for doing this, and look forward to doing that
so
with
fun.
you soon.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yes. Bye.
Yes, I need Kathryn and Aarik's picks so we can plan those shows. And I need yours too. What are your favorite movies, music, and television from 2024? You can let us know on social media or email us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. That's tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. Our show is listener and donor supported, a production of Reframe Ministries. We are a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. You can find more information at reframeministries.org. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder. I'm Josh Larson. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider the best of 2024 and how other corners of the pop culture this year connects with our faith.